Okay, so hello everyone. Before I introduce our keynote speaker and his presentation, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining this meeting. This is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They're the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're here today to listen to the keynote address by Professor Bill Muth from the Commonwealth University of Virginia in the US. Bill has had a long career as a prison literacy teacher and as a researcher on incarcerated fathers who participated in a family literacy program called Hope House with their children in a federal prison in the US. And his presentation today is Doing Time, 10 years research on arts-based family literacy program in US prisons. And I hadn't met Bill prior to contacting him to invite him to speak to this conference. But the reason I was so keen to have him speak to us is because I read a paper he published called Murals as Text, a sociocultural perspective on family literacy events in the US prisons. And I have to say, it was probably the first, academic paper that I read. And believe me, I do read quite a few academic papers, but it was the first paper that was so moving that it brought me to tears. And I'm feeling teary even just thinking back at the paper. So I'm really, really pleased, Bill, that you've agreed to speak to us and to share your work. And I have here with me our colleagues, Janet Dine, adult literacy teacher from Ultimo TAFE, and Kerry Hooper Richardson, adult literacy teacher from North Sydney TAFE. So after Bill's presentation, Janet and Kerry will join in a discussion about some of the ideas that Bill shares with us. So I think it's over to you now, Bill. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keiko, for that really generous introduction. As Keiko said, I am emeritus professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in so-called Richmond, Virginia, land stolen from the Powhatan and Monacan and Chickahominy and other tribes and nations. It's an honor to share this review of the main thrust of my research project over the past 10 years with you, and I'm going to bring up some slides now to help me with that. Okay. So I'm going to, Keiko already mentioned Hope House. I'm going to try to, over these next 20 or so minutes, to tell a story about Hope House. It is a project that tries to keep families together who are separated by prison. And they do a lot of things. They have like book taping programs where incarcerated mothers and fathers can read and record books and send them home. They have video conferencing. They have help with visiting. And they also have the most intensive part of their program is their summer camp. The summer camp is a full week of time when, say, any particular camp, there's 15 or so children and maybe 12 or 13 dads. And I could explain later why we're focusing on fathers, but I won't right at this moment. And they spend the entire day inside the prison on the floor, mostly, of the visiting room, which is totally taken over by Hope House, sprawled out across the room. And then in the evening, the children go back to do to a regular camp in a campground with a pond where they can go swimming and have a bonfire and so on. Unfortunately for the fathers, they have to stay inside the prison. But at any rate, that's the summer camp. And at the heart of the summer camp is the mural project. And the murals, that's what we'll be talking about today. So I will come back to that a lot, but just to say before we touch on the murals, that the context for our program is U.S. Criminal justice system, which I suspect you all might know, is not anything like just. It's a very profoundly unjust system that's vastly more Black and brown in terms of the in people who are incarcerated than white, except for very poor white people. The 1 out of 10 Black males in their 30s in the United States is in prison or in jail on any given day. We have roughly 2 million people incarcerated. Our rate, just as a comparison, is 655 per 100,000 people. By comparison, Australia is 160 per 100,000. Much better, but still on the higher end of things. But the US is sadly way out in front. There are, in addition to the 2 million incarcerated people, 1.7 million children under the age of 18 with a parent in either a state or a federal prison. So this is my research that I'm going to be talking about, but I will hope to keep it as practical as possible and always bring it back to the aspect of literacy. I think of, as Keiko mentioned, I see murals very much as a form of composition, like any other kind of text. And often words and titles and stuff are superimposed on them. So this is very much a literacy project. But what I found over the years is that my original lenses for how to study Hope House kept getting me only so far and ended up raising more questions than they answered. So that was why there was this evolving set of lenses, primarily from constructivist lenses to phenomenology. And the big difference there is that in constructivist research, you're asking these family members who are down on the floor composing a mural what it means. You're asking for them to reflect consciously on what those experiences mean to them. In phenomenology, you go a little deeper. You, of course, want to know what folks say things mean, but you also want to get beneath the words to the lived experiences that are always super complicated, and who knows what they mean. You know, we're always trying to unpack what the heck just happened. So phenomenology has a different approach to it. They obviously are really important to go together. So starting out, not really at the very beginning, but for our purposes, roughly 2008, I was using, as Keiko mentioned, a sociocultural lens to really try to understand how families reflected on and gave meaning to their art projects. I used some of the work of Chris Gutierrez, who had a term called testimonios, which was a term used for marginalized and displaced families from Central and South America who found a space. Often they rented a space or were given a stage somewhere where they could claim their rights. They could tell the world who they are. And they might have a coat of arms, they might have a legend that goes with their story. But it was a way for those voices to be heard. And it was an act of radical politics for allowing those voices to be heard. And I think just simply sometimes allowing these, sometimes considered the pariah of society that are just as human as you and me and everyone else, to allow that humanity to shine through can be quite radical. So we came to see, though, that the murals were not just testimonies, that is, not just the statement, the text, the visual, but they were performative spaces as well. And these performances were where families could enact or reenact their belonging to each other. And we'll see some examples as we go through. Salman Rushdie famously once said that family stories are a badge of membership. So when you sit around a table with family and you remember the time, if you don't have those stories, you're not really, you don't feel quite as connected. So family stories, rebuilding narratives are truly and quite literally a way of belonging to each other, to become members again of a family. I'm going to read just a really quick passage of I'm calling the father Louis and the son Malik, but they were on the floor, much like these two here. And this is super complicated, so I'll try to keep it as clear as possible. Malik did not know that the woman he thought was his biological mother was his stepmother. And Louis was trying desperately to find a way to do it. And we'll see how murals create these safe, kind of slightly structured but open flowing spaces for conversations, all kinds of conversations to happen. So they were on the floor, doing the murals. And then Malik says something about like, how come you and mom never got married? And of course, mom was really stepmom, but he didn't know it. So Louis is telling me the story and he says like, I said that was because I was already married to a woman named Cheryl. Cheryl was actually Malik's mother. Are you following this? Hang in there. It's just so Louis is explaining to Malik that he was already married to a woman named Cheryl, which he didn't tell him, but he said, and she was a very beautiful person. And there was a lot that was communicated in the unspoken word. He said, she had big, beautiful brown eyes, just like you. And so then Malik says, so where's she at now? And he was like, oh, well, she's dead. She killed herself. And Malik said, why? And he said, well, she was depressed, and some people are stronger than others when it comes to depression. And Malik says, well, I don't care how sad I get. I'll never kill myself. And Louis says, man, that's so beautiful, because that's one of my biggest concerns, that is hereditary. So and not all the stories on the floor are like that. A lot of them could be like, did you see those shoes I got? There's all over the map, but art literacy opens up all kinds of dialogue. So, yeah, so that's that. And out of these carefully structured, unstructured spaces, right? Like each family has its own mural, but other than maybe an artist giving them a rough sketch, it's up to the family. The family designs, it's their ideas for what it's going to be and so on. And out of these unstructured spaces, the families do the work of reviving their own identities and their families. Or not, maybe for the first time, some kids are meeting their fathers for the very first time and constructing brand new narratives. And this is, again, political space. Why? Because unlike most top-down programs in the federal prison system that, if you take a parenting class, it assumes you don't know anything about being a parent, and it'll tell you what to do by the experts. And this program trusts families to be able to interpret their own predicaments for themselves. So I will give you one more example of also what it does is gives them a chance to work through what it means to be a father, for example. What I heard often from the men that I interviewed the fall after the summer camps was that one of the things they learned by being incarcerated was being a father. They learned that what it meant to be a provider. And so what it really meant to be a provider was to give time to your kids, which of course sounds trite or too little too late, but it was a consistent theme. So here's Louis again. he's saying, he's talking about like when he was on the street and he could throw like toys and bicycles and stuff at Malik. And he said, but now inside you realize that true wealth is the lessons you can teach your child, the time you're able to spend with your child. These things come from within the self. And this is truly being a father. Teaching your child is truly being a father and not buying your child, which I really love that quote. So these are the kinds of reflected wisdoms that come out of sociocultural approaches to literacy, and not just in research, but as practitioners. When we use these whole language open approaches, we open this credible world full of risks and full of promise as well. Another thing that in the social cultural milieu or model that what I learned about was how not only did incarcerated fathers develop and refine their sense of what it means to be a father, but also what it means to do time. So there's all kinds of time: prison time, visit time, phone time. Those three, all you feel the presence of an oppressive, heavy clock or calendar weighing down on you all the time. And what's weird is, and that is really what I think probably the punishment of incarceration is. It's the continuous experience of oppression of the temporal experience of prisons. But, you know, incarcerated people are very resilient and crafty. And Timothy, another father, told me about how he got away from doing prison time. And the way he did it was he did other people's time, which sounds very weird. But what he meant by that was, say a new person, Timothy was doing a lot of time, like 30 years. And so when a new person came into prison, he would go up to him and say, how much time are you doing? They'd say 5 years. He'd say, okay, I'm doing your time for you. And then he would not see him or whatever. But then on the day that guy left, he'd walk up. This is how he told the story. He would walk up to him and say, good luck on the outside. And then he would say to himself, okay, I just knocked 5 years off of my sentence. So the point of that was that you looking up to see when time is going by is an excruciating experience, as you can understand, especially for people, well, for everyone who's being kept against their will. So minimizing the frequency of looking up can make your life a lot less painful. And so there were other aspects of temporality that were also reflected on in these early research projects. There was mural time. Mural time was absolutely not prison time. In mural time, time flowed. You would be talking about the past, maybe when you're going to graduate in the future. Like all times are flowing in mural time. It's a very different kind of experience of time itself. There's the rhythm of time. So for instance, in Hope House, it's not like you just do a summer camp and then you don't see your loved ones again for a year, because there's going to be a phone call next week. There's going to be a book recording a couple of weeks later. There'll be a visit after that. Ideally, this doesn't always work out. The idea being, though, is that these relationships can be quite nourished by the rhythm of contact, even if it's not always as enriched as doing the murals. So this interruption of prison time is real, it's profound, and art literacy, when families are brought together, can be a main part of that. There's also time like permanence. Permanence could be a good thing or a bad thing. In some, like Susan Rosenberg was part of the Weather Underground, she talked about being stuck permanently as a criminal. Her life was frozen on the date of her crime, and she will always be stuck at that permanent point in the past. There is no present, there is no future. But there's other kinds of permanence too, like Timothy talked about his daughter, how she said to him, like, I will always run to you, Daddy, when she was like 4 years old. That for Timothy provided a grounding. It may not exactly be permanence, but it was a stabilizing kind of force that was quite temporal, because that knowing that her daughter was always there for him was an anchor of a different kind, not of that stigma, but actually an anchor that opened up to his being a father. All right. But let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be stuck in time, on the sort of the dark side of that for a minute. Well, it's weird that how, at least in the United States, we have a very positivist model. It's all behavioral, it's all incremental, top down. You have to measure your grade level equivalent, advances in literacy every 6 months. I'm sure you all have similar things. And there's nothing wrong with that's the sort of, there's a place for that type of organized literacy for sure. But there's also this sense of futurity that is hovers in the background that I learned as we kind of moving on in the research. This idea of time just was so fascinating, and it still is to me. But so, for instance, the prison systems talk about temporality. They talk about it like, here's the Bureau of Prisons mission statement. It says, I won't read the whole thing, it just says, through the provision of education and vocation, inmates are well prepared for a crime-free return to society. Again, its whole orientation is, we're going to prepare you now for then, when you get out. Researchers perpetuate that sense of, you can't do anything while you're in prison. You may as well just prepare for when you get out. Reentry, in the United States, we have this term reentry, which started out as a good thing, but it's really skewed everything towards the future, towards when you get out. Reentry is the system overseeing the release of prisoners. Okay, well, what happens to living during the rest of the time when you're doing your time? But because if you are stuck in time, and the sense of you can't have a future that you can readily bring up into your imagination, that is anything but depressing or hopeless, right? That is a very material thing. That is not just fantasy. That affects your body in a material way. So what we heard from many incarcerated people about, the future, and what can they do while they're inside? Like, what is it like being a father inside? And they would say, well, I'm not able to be there. I'm not able to be there for any crisis, for any occasion. Sometimes people would like you to be there and you're not. And the other person said, you can't do very much because I'm stuck in here. There's nothing I can do. I can speak to her on the phone when she's upset. I can speak to her on the phone when she's naughty. There's nothing I can really do when she comes here. So there's this sense of futurity. When you have no capacity to imagine a future, and everything is oriented to the future, is there any wonder why, like, our students are sometimes not motivated? I think this is also, not to go off on a tangent, but children, young people thinking about climate change. I think we have a very real issue with them imagining a healthy and viable and empowered future. And I think that's a real challenge for educators. But anyway, so this sense of hopelessness, this sense of I can't do anything, I'm incapacitated. I understood that, of course, and respected it. But there was one quote from a very respected fellow researcher from Virginia. Her name is Joyce Arditi. And she wrote, incarceration represents a dormant period for men in terms of fatherhood, and reentry signifies a chance to start over. And I thought to myself, I love Joyce Arditi, and I wrote to her and I said, this was so helpful because I couldn't disagree more, but it opened up, it put the finger on what I knew something was missing in my research. The sociocultural research that allowed folks to consciously reflect on the meanings are incredibly important. But oftentimes, words say too much, and words don't say enough. And there was this idea that, this sense of I can't do anything, it just didn't begin to get at the energy that I felt around even men who weren't part of Hope House. And they may have, that energy may have been in the form of despair. I had one person from a literacy program who said he tries as hard as he can to not think about home, because every time you think about home, he just goes bonkers. Well, that is not dormancy. That's something else. So that phrase launched me into, with the help of a really wonderful colleague at VCU, into the use of phenomenology to study the lived experiences. So when we think about futurity from a phenomenological perspective, it's more than just that reflective sense of I can't do anything. It's no longer doing. It's not about what you are doing. It's about who you are being. And so I'll try to unpack that a little bit, because this could get a little woo-woo. I'm going to try and make my best not to let it do that. Phenomenology is the study of lived experience as it is unfolding, before our thoughts catch up. So, like you're walking on the street and all of a sudden you realize your jaw's clenched and you go, and then you realize that you saw a different car go by and it reminded you of something, but you had no idea it did. And all of a sudden your brain catches up to it. So that's what phenomenology tries to do, is it tries to get at that lived moment before we put it into words and reduce it to words. And the term reduction in phenomenology actually means it comes from the Latin reduco, which means to go back to the thing itself. It's no longer what I think and say about time, but it's more about how does time reveal itself through my texts, through my voice. So for instance, as we know, words our texts can block or they can reveal. They do both. Everything we do both reveals and conceals the lived experiences. This mural, which is really hard to see here, this is Lewis and Malik. Malik is at the very top, and Lewis is trying to get out of prison. He's trying to scale the wall. And Malik is just about to grab his dad's hand and help him up. And in the background, there's you can't really see, but there's eagles who are getting ready to swoop in. And I asked Malik later, I asked him oh, so are those eagles good guy eagles or bad guy? Are they going to help you, or are they going to attack you? And he said, we don't know. And what I love about this mural is how contingent it is. To me, this mural, maybe more than any other, and I've seen a million beautiful murals, really captures the sort of the lived, this is present, being in the present is this. You don't know how these horizons are going to unfold, what that bird is going to look like, whether that hand is going to make it. Another example of the difference between constructivist and phenomenological approach would be, say I asked a father, what is it like when you get a letter from home? And the dad would say, well, it's great because I feel connected. So that's a meaning, and we could unpack what it means to be connected. What does that mean? Because, what is connection, But from a phenomenal perspective, what I'm thinking is not so much what it means, but how is that meaning lived? Is connection to guilt? Is connection to fear, to panic? Is it to joy? Is it to hope? Is it all of the above? And that is a very difficult thing. You can't just ask that directly in a research question, right? Or if you're a teacher and your students are sharing these stories with you, there's a great deal of intuition that has to happen to get to, and there's also a whole methodology in terms of the research, but that's another story for another day. Let me give you one example. So the father, Timothy, I mentioned before, he talked about looking down. And he said, when you look down in prison, that's like dead time. It's like you're detached. You're walking around in a daze. You're just minding your own business. You're trying not to get sucked into any gang stuff going on and all of that. And there's no agency. You're not in control of anything. You're just caught up in your, if you're an orderly or whatever your job is, you're just caught up in that and you're not really thinking. So that's how we describe looking down. Then when I asked him about looking up, it was a very more complicated set of things going on. So his daughter, we will call Abby, and when Timothy was talking about looking up, meaning paying attention, when you are engaged with family members on the phone or whatever, you can't help but be back in time. When looking down, you can escape time. When you are with people that you love who are, are sort of going through the milestones of life, birthdays, graduations, and marriages, and all of the rest. And it's instantly, you're looking back up into temporality again. So when he described that Abby, his relationship with Abby, he said in the same utterance, he said, Abby is here for me. I have to get to her. And this is a beautiful example from the phenomenological perspective. This is like a field day, because you have these two statements that kind of contradict each other. And yet from a reflective perspective, they're both true. But it's not enough to just say it's this or it's that. They came so close together that you have to stop thinking of it in terms of linear stuff, because what's present is this rush of pasts and futures. It's nonlinear. It's often very barely manageable for all of us, and it can be quite beautiful and it can be quite scary. So the Abby side is when Abby is here for me, it gives him that sense of stability, of being grounded. It opens his past, it opens his future. It allows him to perform as a father in his imagination. But in the same instance that he's having this lived pre-conscious, he's not thinking this out loud. This is all happening at the sort of the pre-reflective experience. That could happen. This whole thing can happen in a flash. At the same time, there's the guilt, there's the fear. One of the intense fears is, and I heard this from many fathers too, is this fear that they will be forgotten by their children, or even worse, that they would forget their children. Their mind games that go on when you're doing a long time is pretty brutal. So there's some despair and guilt, and all of these things are flooding in as well. So rather than think of them in categorical terms or as themes, as you might if you were doing like that kind of research, let's just say that the lived experience, the presence of Abby is a presence and an absence. It is both. And so it's really painful as also as it is healthy to be looking up. So if we look on the right-hand column, it repeats what we were just talking about. The good thing about looking up is that Abby is here, it restores my sense of self, my sense of belonging, but the downside is I'm feeling all this guilt and so on. And these are simultaneous. Think of them storm clouds and weather, like horizons are constantly shifting and there's no linear aspect to it. The one is the flip side of the other. As stability seeps into our body, it's moving in from the background of panic and fear of being lost. So one defines the other, and it's an entanglement that never ends. And then again, going back to the left-hand column, the options then to avoid that messiness is to look down, to be dormant. And then the good news is you can avoid all that confusion. The bad news is you do begin to lose your narrative self, your loss of memory and time, and so on. So these are the paradoxes that I was able to sort of unearth through more and more conversations, and also like looking between the lines for how one utterance led to the other, and they were like one was staging the other, so to speak. So let's just say that lived experience of being a father in prison is contingent. It is a sense of being contingent at all times, that nothing is ever permanent, that nothing is ever given. Okay, wrapping up here. So phenomenology shifts from epistemology, which is what we can know, to ontology, which is what I am, what is reality. And another way to ask that question is, who am I and who am I being? And another way to ask it is, what is it like to be a father in prison, or to be a child with an incarcerated father? But no matter how we ask the ontological question, it's always in the present. It's always, that's to say, if we ask it from a reflection perspective, people can reflect back on it, which was my earlier research. But if we're seeking to understand how we're looking for glimpses of unlikely people living as intact human beings, living with a past and a future that's intimate and present, then we have to retune ourselves to the existential, to what is really happening right now, what's flowing through all of the partial glimpses and so on. So I talk about presencing as a policy or as a program approach. And my thoughts are that that presencing provides support for and dignity for incarcerated fathers and mothers who are in their being intact. By intact, I mean they are in touch with their past and their futures. They've got their whole temporal being. Being is temporal, and intact means having openness to all of it. And so presencing is support for them as they are being intact parents in the here and now while in prison. But it also means providing material support for them to connect with their children. You can't sustain a sense of that Timothy has, Abby is here for me. That would never be sustainable if he didn't have Abby in his life materially and physically, at least from time to time. It doesn't have to be every week, it doesn't have to be every month, but it has to be predictable and regular. And it has to be quality mural time, like I use the term mural time, it has to be quality living time, not visiting room time, which can be okay. But oftentimes visiting room time, you're just obsessed with the clock ticking. So you're still stuck in prison time. All right, so presencing programs need to bring kids together with their incarcerated parents and then create spaces and get out of the way of family members so that they can perform their own belonging to each other again. There's lots of presencing programs, and I mentioned my book. If you shameless promotion, there's a chapter on presencing programs in Europe and the United States. But for closing for now, just to say that presencing, I think of it, tying it back to literacy, it is the texts themselves that provided the space for these families to do this performative work. I call that being in text, because it's more than just the conscious writing of the text. It's the presence that's happening. It's all the other stuff that's happening while you are co-constructing. And so just in a final slide, just to say, my earliest impressions of Hope House was there were testimonials that were defiant and courageous and hopeful, which I still believe in. I still think that's one of the great parts, huge parts of it. Also, there's a defiance that has to do with temporality that I wasn't as quite understanding of earlier on, that I still just know just the tip of the iceberg, but the sense of being able to look up into time, to me, is the essence of doing time, but doing it with agency, but also with vulnerability. Then the moving more to the living, the presence, the asness. The word as is super important because I use it in terms of like, as we are speaking, like right now, the as lived timescapes, that they're being family, they're being father, they're being daughter, they're being son. It's always contingent, always shifting horizons, but also the final understanding that I've come to in my limited work is the idea of murals as clearings, that these spaces are clearings for the dwelling of beings as families, so that they're safe places for that kind of presence to be as healing and as nourishing as possible, and where the scary horizons can be sort of tamped down for a while. Okay, and there's a picture of my book, yay, that came out in 2018, but I will stop right there and open up for questions. So that's it, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill. So moving and such important work, and I don't know where to start, so I'm going to hand over to Carrie or Janet to start the conversation. So
I have that effect on people, you know, it's like, I don't know.
I'm happy to start. Bill, thank you for that. That was amazing. And a lot resonated, but one thing certainly was your concept. And again, it's just that light bulb moment of going, oh, that's why. The looking down and looking up. The experience I had on Monday I'm in a forensic hospital. And a little bit differently is explained to me, the temporal concept is a little bit different. The patients, inmates, are not given a sentence, so they don't know when they are going to be released. It's down to doctors, nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists. So they could be there for a week, they could be there for their life. They don't know. And a beautiful experience on Monday. I was working with one patient, and he quite clearly, now I can see, was looking up. He saw an exit, he saw an end, he saw where he could progress to, and this guy is that unfortunate term which I hate, but illiterate. So we're working on the alphabet with him, but he had so many plans and he was excited and just looking up, definitely. But in that same class, just, you know, on the next desk was a particular patient who, not that morning, but the previous morning, had been to see his doctors. And when I say he came in a black mood, it was darker than black. There was just emptiness to him, and he would not communicate, and was in such a looking down negativity. It was very, very challenging to crack even a little bit of anything out of him. So that has made now you said that, that's made a lot of sense to me. How I break through that looking down, I have no idea yet, because it's different for every patient, student, inmate, whatever title we're going with. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really well, it's very moving. Yeah, so it's very different for sure. Yeah, like how our environments create the spaces for us to experience time or not to experience it. And so yeah, I think but I think it's so for me, this idea of knowing that, like our imagined, even unconscious, our imagined, our orientation, let's say, to a future or not, is so important. And I think we take it for granted. We do in this, and I say it with our behavioral models, like you will, I remember like counselors saying, you will create a positive mental attitude, you will, and I'm thinking, oh God, but we have this naive sense that like futures are something concrete, not in our imaginary, and or that imaginary is not real, when in fact imaginary is profoundly real. It colors our mood and our capacity to get out of bed. So I mean, what you were describing, Carrie, is so beautiful and complex, and I'm glad that was at least helpful a little bit. I hope
definitely, yeah.
It would be interesting to know how some can be empowered, and some are disempowered.
Yeah.
I really love the way that you brought in the phenomenology into practice, into our practice, that idea, and it opens up quite our thinking as to our practice, what we're doing. It's very, very different from perspectives that are being worked through at the moment in terms of literacy practice generally, but this idea of opening up spaces, and opening up spaces that art does that and literacy does that, opened up spaces for students to be in and to actually be themselves in and to be aware in, and those sorts of things, and to belong in. That reminds me so much of what literacy practice has been in the past, how it was in the 90s, for example, when we saw it like that as a socio-cultural practice. It worries me now that there's been a degradation of literacy and education in prisons, and I saw statistics trying to justify, okay, it's going all right, is completion rates of literacy courses, and a lot of that have gone up, but actually the spaces, those courses are so prescriptive, can be prescriptive, it's actually shutting down the spaces that, rather than opening them up, because they're quite prescriptive. That's a lot of the curriculum is quite contrary to that opening up of spaces, and that sense, I've often felt as though students who come for literacy classes in the past, it's a sense of alienation that people have, and that I've often felt that literacy practice is to help people overcome a sense of alienation. And the spaces, the safe spaces that are created in classes are definitely are spaces where those sorts of things can happen. I love the idea that you talk about the risks and the affordance that's so present in that situation where you're creating this space. And as Kerry was saying, these spaces, anything can happen, especially especially in prison, but also in our literacy classes generally.
Totally.
And thinking about the role of art, and I'm thinking about the mural itself is a huge space.
Yeah.
In a way, like it's a physical space in terms of an artwork where families can be in that space, and that's an amazing concept of that. But art generally, I'm remembering when I was working in prisons, that fathers liked even to do colouring. Colouring became huge, to do colouring, and they do these great things, that adult colouring books that had like kind of mandala kind of patterns, gorgeous patterns, and they would do them to send to their children. And the only text they write on it something like "Love from Dad," but that was they couldn't come into the prison to do that wonderful project that you're talking about, but they were sharing this space as they were doing they were thinking of their kids as they were doing this, and they were also writing in the text, "Love from Dad."
I said, what's really so yeah, oh gosh, there's so much, so many ideas. Well, one thing is like that's a beautiful example of that simple coloring, right? So, and this is where that sense of rhythm of time comes in. Like one of the things of trying to rebuild family is for like a child to not feel like it's going to be it's infinity before my mother or my father comes home. That's that sense of like profound chasm, right? So the mandala gets colored, it gets sent home, but then the next time they have a phone call, they actually have something to talk about. So one builds the other, and so these little things, if they're built into some regularity, can make such a difference. Now the child is looking forward 2 weeks instead of 2 years, which is, the difference between hope and despair.
I'm wearing my my vintage T-shirt today, the Broomgate Gallery.
Nice.
That was and apparently it still exists, but it was huge for inmates when I was working there in the 90s, and it was a connection between the inside space and the outside space as well, that inmates made beautiful artworks for their families, but they also with the broader community, they were connecting with the community by their art space. But just some other something else I wanted to mention is that the importance of art in Indigenous for Indigenous inmates, and your statistics that you gave are very, very shocking, but about the rate of incarceration of people of colour, and you'll be aware that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the rate of incarceration is very shocking here too. But what was interesting in that space, in the art rooms, inmates were discovering more about their own culture in sharing with other inmates, and they would be delving into spaces of their own culture by doing art there. And that was very much a part of, as you were talking about, a sense of belonging, and that's a very powerful thing, I think.
It's beautiful. Vivian Gadsden from the University of Pennsylvania used to always talk about art is democratizing, because it can't be top down. It's sort of like owned by the people doing it. It's inclusive that way. So it's called the Boom Gallery.
Boomgate.
Boomgate. Okay. Boomgate.
Because it was at the Boomgate at the prison.
I'm definitely gonna look into that.
Yeah.
There's one other thought about like this sense of like we don't want to vilify, like top down like literacy learning. There's a place for incremental learning, but the problem is if it's just that, if like just one day a week we could use literacy to support writing letters home, just like one you know, it maybe have this, but it's such a, when it becomes like all or nothing, and then that culture sets in. And I've had teachers, and even in like K-12, but definitely in prison ed, who would say like, oh, we could never have them tell their own stories. That would be like opening Pandora's box.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, but I think that, you know, if you are a new teacher and all you know is that prison culture, I can see why you think that. So part of professional development could be to show folks how it can be risky, but it can be profoundly important, you know, and beautiful.
It's I've the patients that I'm working with at the moment, you were talking about art time, education time, music and exercise. It interrupts incarceration time, and very much so. And I think generally they do look forward to a different break of routine.
Yes.
And then when they come to class, you're kind of like a new puppy. It's a new person to talk to, a new person to see. We're not wearing green or blue. When I went for the induction, they did say don't wear green or blue, because it's good to see a different color. It's a shame I like black, but whatever. You know, you were talking about them telling their stories. I think it's good for new people to go in because they want to tell their stories. It's just us not telling our stories. That's what you've got to be careful of. And it's really hard when somebody is disclosing whatever they are and telling you all about that, you're not going, oh yeah, I understand, I get it. No, don't say anything. Yes. So it feels to me it feels very rude that it's not it seems not a two-way conversation. It's very much one way, but hey.
Yeah, it's tricky for sure.
Yeah.
But I really do like the idea that of the creation of that safe space, and I think that's part of our work as practitioners, is to be able to do that, and it's not just us, it's the students themselves, the inmates and our students is to participate in creating that space in which people feel safe and can take risks.
And I think, you know, art and arts-based literacy teaching and creating a safe space, an open space, you know, not just in prisons, but it allows the learners, the students, to be able to express who they are or who they want to be in the way they imagine who they are and who they want to be, rather than, you know, sitting in a literacy class where, well, in Australia now anyway, all of the curriculum has very behavioral outcomes, you know, read and comprehend routine text for work, you know, everything is for work. And then, you know, somebody writes a booklet that you're supposed to teach to about working in whatever, you know, as a childcare worker. Well, that might appeal to some, but you know, there's no room for the students to say, well, actually, I don't want to be a childcare worker. And it's just so concerning that the policy space is narrowing so much that we can't, you know, everything about teaching says you've got to know your learners and how they learn and what they want to learn. Where is the space for that in the current adult literacy context? And you know, hearing your story, Bill, and Carrie's and Janet's, about how complex the work of, adult literacy teachers and the prisons are, and also knowing how the prison education has been, I don't know if decimated is too much of an exaggeration, but you really need skilled, committed, knowledgeable, empathetic teachers who can work with all of the contingencies that they have to deal with. And doesn't solve any problems, but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, it's so complex, because the more we do this one style of pedagogy, the more the teachers get normed into that, and then it becomes riskier and difficult for them. But there are really wonderful exemplars of what I call presencing programs in prisons, particularly in EU countries. So like you have Barlinnie prison in Scotland. I watched when they brought a father in, called him off for work detail or something, which you would never get called off work because work is the almighty thing in the United States. They called him off a work detail because they had a teacher conference with a teacher and his daughter on the phone at the same time. And the teacher wanted the father to lay down the law for his daughter in a loving way, but I mean, it was like, that was just one tiny example of this sort of engaging, parents can be engaged in the lives of their children. And a lot of the European model follows the United Nations Charter on the Rights of Children. So a lot of it comes through the rights of children, the right to have regular access to their parents. And there are other rights that the person that's being punished is the person that committed the crime, not the family members. Family members should not be punished as well. So that we're in silos in the United States. Prisons, penology is here, education is over in a different silo. So no one talks about children inside of prisons. But in the EU, at least in their charters, which are non-binding but really important, they talk about it is the responsibility of the warden to make sure that to find out where the children are of these incarcerated people and make sure they have continuous access to them, and so on. So there really are some great examples, largely based on the rights charters. So yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, but it's just been so well. Your presentation has been so amazing and so inspirational. And even though, we don't have quite the right policy environment in Australia at the moment, I think having those stories give us hope. So Hope House has given us hope, and you've given us hope. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of the colleagues who will be at the conference. And I'd also like to say thank you to Terry and Janet for sharing your stories with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really, really a pleasure. And I don't want folks to leave feeling like, well, what we have is terrible, and because it's at least as bleak in the United States as it is where you are, and moving in the wrong direction too. But I do think, we touched on a little bit, there are ways to create small, safe spaces, like Janet was saying. How could we just try to carve out one day a week to have a whole language experience where students can dictate their own stories? Just start with some of those constructivist models, one day a week. So I think it's just getting a toehold in them. So, but anyway.
Okay, I'll just stop recording, but